Hey, I'm Brad, and welcome back to a brand new series of Through the Decades, the podcast. This series, I'm in Gabriel Court in Saffron Walden, Essex, which is another McCarthy Stone retirement living development. And just like last time, throughout this series, I'll be interviewing some of the homeowners and getting an insight into their entire lives from their childhood through until now. Kickstarting this series, I am joined by Joe, who is 93 years young.
I was born in 1929 in a place called Thornton Heath, which in those days was in Surrey. It's not now, it's in Greater London. Where I lived quite happily. and then the war came. We were bombed out, I think it was 1940, the spring of 1940, at which point there was no home, so I was a late evacuee. I didn't go with the school. I went with just my brother and I, and so I went down to a place called Dorchester in Dorset. Before I left, I had taken the scholarship, but I hadn't, it hadn't worked because of the war. So when I went down there for first 3 months, I was at a funny little school, and then I went to the local grammar school. Because of my results. I had a very happy time. I loved being in the country. I loved being with farmers and the sea. I was thoroughly happy. I did find out that education in London was way ahead of education down in the country, so I stood well. I loved my school life to such an extent that when the war ended, I didn't go home. I stayed until I got my last exams because I liked it, which I duly did. I then came back to London. I wanted to go to university, but my generation, my father just said, ridiculous, no girls go to university. And despite being persuaded by my headmistress that I should. So all he allowed me was a year at a secretarial college, which had to be paid for. I left there in 1949. Sorry, it sounds ancient. And I straight away went to work in the City of London. Again, I had 10 years working in the City of London in 2 different firms. And again, I loved every minute of it. As you can gather, I say I loved my life. And I stayed there until I got married in 1957. And I picked the right husband. I will always say that. And in those days, you couldn't stay in your job if you were married. You had to leave immediately. Fortune. And then we decided, he was a commuter. He worked at Lloyd's of London. He was an insurance broker at Lloyd's of London. But we wanted to move, and we moved down to the south coast. And then he commuted up. I stopped working then. I tell people I retired in 1957, which sounds ridiculous, but I was able to. But I didn't waste my time. In those days, there was a lot more voluntary work. And for the rest of my life, I did voluntary work for the church, for the village, and Meals on Wheels, anything. And take old people to hospital, because I didn't have to work, so I was fortunate. I then had 2 children. I had a son in 1960 and a daughter in 1963. The years go by. They leave home for their careers, and I had a wonderful life. And Tony retired at 60, despite being asked to stay on to be consultant. He said he'd had enough of work. During his working life, he travelled the world, America an awful lot, and I was fortunate I travelled with him. So in his working career, the firm liked wives to go, and so I've been to Japan. That's about the only real place in the southeast. We thoroughly knew New York. We knew New York better than London almost, because we were always there. And all over the United States we went. He also did a lot in Holland and places in Europe, Germany a lot. Sometimes I went, sometimes he just flipped over. And we just had a wonderful time. I travelled first class, so it was no hardship. And it was just a lovely life, a really lovely life. When he retired at 60, I also liked it. The children had left home by then, and we could do what we liked. We did laugh and say that now when we travelled, we had to travel tourist or club class if it was a distance, but our days of first class travel were over. And I don't think that exists with the firm to the extent that it did in our day. So time goes on. We did enjoy it. We lived on the South Downs, and we just went out a lot. I've always been a great walker. We've even had walking holidays, and we just lived in there. I mean, when the children grew up, we lived at the sea, so my life was on the beach a lot for them. Time goes by. Tony, unfortunately, who was really 100% fit, suddenly, I thought he would outlive me, he suddenly got vascular dementia. And it wasn't difficult because we all treated it quite lightly. We didn't exactly make fun of him, but we made fun of the difficulties, like what he was watching. And the grandchildren, by now, they had come up, and they used to be with us a lot, and they would say if they thought Pops, as they called him, looked a bit off, they'd say, shall we take him upstairs and put Dad's Army on? It was always Dad's Army. And eventually he did go to a nursing home because I found it difficult to cope with. And then again, we always thought he'd live to be 100 because all his family died in their 90s. But unfortunately he didn't. He died in his early 80s. So I stayed in the house down on the south coast because I loved my life. By now I worked an awful lot in the local National Trust as a volunteer, as well as running the village library, which was only one morning a week. We got the books from the general library at the nearby town, but Wednesday morning in the village it was library and coffee. You came and I changed the books in the good old-fashioned stamp, nothing modern. And I really and truly loved my life in a little place called Alfriston on the South Downs. But my daughter lived by now in Clavering. She doesn't now, Clavering. And she said, Mum, I'd like you to come up and be nearer because of her journey. They came an awful lot. The children loved to come because it was the coast. But it could sometimes be a 4-hour journey if the traffic was bad. And she told my son, by now was in Canada, and she told him, I'm trying to get Mum up near me, and he said, you don't stand a hope in hell. But anyway, after 2 years, I decided I'd give in and come up for her sake, not for mine. I could still manage my life, my house and everything, but it wasn't fair on her. And so she basically found this. And I used to come up an awful lot. I used to come up at least once a month for a few days. And one day she said, why don't you come and look at Gabriel Court? And she said, I never thought it. Anyway, I looked and I thought, I liked this apartment. I was one of the early ones, so it was quite a choice. I like it because I don't get overlooked. All my life, I've not had to pull curtains. When I lived on the South Downs, I didn't have to pull curtains. So here, I don't have to pull curtains. That doesn't say I don't, but I don't have to. Nobody can look in. And I went back on the train that day, which took many, many hours because of crossing London. And all the time on the train, I kept thinking, will I find a flat like that when I've got to go? I always said I'd come up when I was 90. You know, that was me, because I was so fit. You know. And I went to bed that night and I woke up the next morning and I thought, I like the flat. When I have to go, if I have to go, I won't find what I like. So I never, ever thought I would live north of the Thames. People who are born in the south, north of the Thames, you just don't go to. But my daughter ended up here. She's married to a New Zealander, so he didn't mind where he lived. And so I came up when I was 83. So I've been here 10 years.
Wow.
I have no complaints about my life. Now, isn't that a dreadful thing to say in this day and age when there's so much tragedy in the world? There's so many people of my age that are in need and can't do it. There was nothing I can't do. When I came out of hospital last year, I did have living carers for a while, which I didn't like. But as I got better, and I look after myself, and I have an excellent cleaner, and my hairdresser comes, so I'm fine. I go out to lunch twice a week with the gentleman next door, so I know. And no, I really think I do say I'm blessed, and I say I'm blessed in my prayers every night.
It's so lovely to hear that, it really is. What do you remember about the place you grew up? Obviously you mentioned the war was a very prominent part of growing up.
Yes,
How was life growing up?
Fine. My parents weren't terribly wealthy, but we had a good childhood, you know. I think I was always born fairly independent. You know, I never fussed or anything about anything. I mean, when I was evacuated, I think I was just 10. I wasn't sad. You know, I wasn't crying. I'd say goodbye to my mother, but I could stand on my own 2 feet without any worry. And I've really always been like that.
So, how was your school life intertwined with obviously the war?
Well, there was a time, the first winter of the war, schools in our area were all evacuated en masse. And I didn't want, or my parents didn't want me to go, I suppose. I adored school. I adored school from the time I went. It was my whole life. I could have all wept when schooling ended. I loved it that much. And that's why I wanted to go to university. But it just wasn't done in my day. Girls didn't go. So, yeah, and then, all right, I didn't go. I loved working in the city. I still love the city. I don't get down there now. I used to meet friends for lunch. And the worst thing about being old, though I don't admit to being old, is that you haven't got any of your friends. I've got one friend of my longest time, for my middle years, and her children and my children grow up. You know, everybody else has died.
Yeah.
And that I found is sad. I'm blessed because the next generation, i.e. my children's generation, the 50s and 60s, our house, when we did live down on the south, was the house where everybody collected. Now, all of those friends, all my children, their parents have all died, but they're still very good to me. Yeah. They keep in touch wherever they are in the world. They will come and see me when they're around. So I still have a lot to do with the next generation down. And then to go down another generation, where I have the 4 grandchildren, they range from 20 to 28. And I can't fault them. I mean, yeah, Grandma's coming, isn't she? They wouldn't have a graduation. Well, Grandma's going to make it, isn't she? And so, yes, I just hate to say I'm blessed.
I love your positive outlook on life.
I've always had that.
It's so contagious, and I love it. Yeah. It's so present. You can really tell, and I love it. What was your first job? So obviously after the school's finished,
yes,
and you're entering the world of work, what was your first job? What was your big career?
Big career. I've always been a mathematician. If I'd gone to the thing, but by now I was a skilled shorthand typist. You don't do shorthand anymore. It's all done what you're doing, but we had to do it at fast speed, and so I chose to work for accountants. And I got my job, I think, from a paper. I did it anyway. So at 18, I joined a firm of accountants in the city. I was very happy, but I was the new girl. It was all rather strange. I met people I hadn't met before. And of course, it was at the end of the war, 1945 it ended. As you can see, my mind's still right. And so you got a lot of soldiers coming back gradually. Yeah. And the City of London, when I worked in it, was a bomb site. I couldn't afford lunch because you didn't get paid much. And whatever your job, you didn't get paid much. So I used to take sandwiches and eat them on the bomb. Where the Barbican is now, was where I used to have my lunch, sitting in bomb disposal thing. I stayed with that firm possibly about 3 years and got to know the city and got to know commuting and travelling and everything. And then a friend of mine said her boyfriend worked for another firm of accountants and they were looking for somebody. Was I ready for a change? So I said, yes, all right, I'll go. And I went for the interview and I got that job. That was the job that was, it was wonderful. It was absolutely wonderful. I was the youngest person. In fact, when the young people in the office, the men, heard that the new secretary was 20, they said, gosh, has she got one leg or one eye? Because this firm doesn't employ anybody young. But I loved it, so much so that the boss I then was the secretary to a senior partner. And he, when I went in one day and he said, how's life? What do you do at the weekend? And I said, oh, my 21st birthday today. So he immediately down tools and sent out for champagne. It was that sort of firm. I was just pleased. And I stayed with them until I got married.
Wow.
And I can tell you, this will shock you, when I got married, I had a good job. Man, my salary was £4.10 shillings a week.
Wow. You've mentioned that you spent a lot of time in London during your working life. How was London back in the day, in quotation marks?
Well, of course, nobody had much money because salaries were low, and they were recovering from the war, and there was bomb damage, and things hadn't got right. When I was working then, it was at a time when you could only, if you went abroad for a holiday, you could only take out £25. That's all you could take. So you can see money didn't matter. Also, restaurants, all those wonderful, the Savoy, which I know extremely well, all of those, you could pay £25 for a good meal, or 25, listen to me, 25p or 50. You know, it was just different. And we weren't very well off. And a friend and I often used to go to, they had a thing called the soup kitchen. It was behind St Martin's in the Fields. Now, soup kitchen sounds very rough, doesn't it? But it was beautiful. There were settees, and you could have joy. When you went, you had tomato soup or minestrone, and you got that with French bread, and that was considered a real night out. So life was very, very different from your day, Bradley. I can't tell you. And then I was sitting in the office one day, and another girl and I were talking, and I said, I'd like to learn to drive. She said, so would I. Well, there wasn't much scope. So we decided to join the Territorial Army. So we went along for the interview in Chelsea at the Duke of York's barracks, which doesn't exist now. And I could sign up because I hadn't shrunk. I was a bit taller. My friend couldn't. She was too short. They wouldn't take her on for driving, so she went as a clerk. So I stayed with the Territorial Army. It's rather, in your day, it would probably be like a youth club, as far as I looked at it. I mean, I was actually taught mechanics of a car by the lady who had taught Princess Elizabeth, as she was then, in there. You know, that was her claim to fame. A little squat, fat sergeant who kept telling you that, you know, what Elizabeth did, you would do. And of course, we had to learn to drive on 3-ton lorries, which I did. So I only stayed for 3 years. By now, I'd met my husband, and he hated me doing it. I loved it. I didn't want to join up. I didn't want to be. I did in the war. I wanted the war to go on long enough so that I could join up, which it didn't do. So you can see, I've always been fairly independently minded.
Yeah. What has been the biggest lesson that you've learned in your life? Because obviously everything that you've experienced comes a lot of lessons.
Accept what's on offer. Make the most of it. Don't hanker after something else and just spend your life thinking, oh, I couldn't do it. You know, just accept each day and make the best of it.
Yeah. That's really lovely to hear. If you could go back to any age or any year, what would it be and why?
Probably 40s, 50s, and from then on. By then your children are teenage, and I love teenage. I do. I love it when they're... I'm not a lover of babies, you have to have those to grow up. But I love children when they're interested and when they're learning and when you learn with them or you do something with them. I mean, living at the sea, we bought a small mirror dinghy when we could afford one for the children. I absolutely hated being on the water because I wasn't a good swimmer. But I did it for their sake.
Yeah.
I went sailing. Soon as my son had been to sailing schools and could crew for his dad, I said, I don't have to go and have a living boat anymore. But I did it. I first went skiing in Norway in my early 20s when there weren't any ski lifts. So in order to come down a hill, you had to, if you know anything about skiing, had to herringbone up. I went with my husband, I'd just met him. I didn't go skiing again until the children were born, and as soon as Sarah was 5, she being the younger, we then went skiing, and we continued to ski for many years. I was never a good skier, the children were, but I enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Because I love the snow. So and living at the coast, we hardly ever had sun. We didn't immediately, when packaged holidays came in the 70s, they were really prevalent. They came in the 60s and 70s. We never did a package holiday. We preferred to go skiing. And we said we lived by the sea, so we didn't need it. And I was very pleased when my daughter and a friend in their 20s were sitting in the garden. They were talking, and they both said, they were talking about their childhood, and they both agreed they'd had wonderful childhoods. But it was a time when most of our neighbours were going to the south of France or Spain and doing that. My kids didn't do it. They did it later, but they didn't. There was just little children because we preferred to stay. We always felt they had to know England. And Sarah married to a New Zealander, and they go to New Zealand and they have travelled. She's always insisted that they know England. And so I go on holiday with them now. We're going up to Yorkshire in September. And again, I can't go upstairs now. And Matt, the youngest, said to his mother, "Oh, so Grandma won't be coming." Of course she will. I made sure there's a bedroom downstairs. No, I hate to feel so satisfied.
Yeah. This is a very big question.
I'll ask it.
But what would you say was the best day of your life? Because I really love your love of life. So there must be quite a few days where you think that has.
It would be hard to pick. It wasn't when I got married. I only got married in white with all the palaver to please my husband and my father. Not for me at all. I don't like being the centre of attention. I mean, somebody else can have a big party for their ages. I don't. I want it quiet. I'm sorry. I want just family. Yeah. I don't like being the centre of. I don't mind going to a party. Yeah. And I can be the life and soul of a party, but I don't want it about me. And when it was my birthday in December, my birthday is December, it was a coffee morning where normally it's announced, and Bev downstairs knew that I did not want them to say, "Oh, it's Joe's birthday today." Those that knew it was could say happy birthday, like John didn't. A few of the other older residents here. But I did not want, "It's her birthday today." I just didn't like it.
So what would you say if you had to choose?
Oh, you want the best day of my life. Probably one time when we went abroad a lot, we ended up knowing a lot of Americans, and oh yes, this might sound silly to you. In those days, New York was thriving. It's not like it is now. It was really thriving, and we were taken to a wonderful restaurant in New Jersey, and by the American people, and they had all the stars from Broadway who, if they were in a show and the show went on tour, they didn't go on tour because they preferred to stay near Broadway for the next one. Sorry, it's a bit complicated. And so this particular restaurant is where all the out-of-work actors were waiters and waitresses. And so while you were having your meal, they would all stop. Suddenly you got your meals and they would stop and they would perform in front of you. And because we were from England and they made more fuss when you were abroad in those days than they do now, they came up and said I could choose any song I wanted. And I had it sung by the person who'd sung it on Broadway. And it was sung just for me in this huge restaurant. I felt very special.
So that would be the best day of your life?
Yes, because other than that, life was just good.
Yeah. So what would you say you are most proud of in your life?
Living and not being a nuisance to people.
And when you were younger, what was your big dream? What was your big aspiration for when you grew up?
To go to university and become a professor of mathematics.
Wow.
But I had to give it up, so yeah, I did. My father said, oh, well, it's up to you. When you get older, you can, do it, but you don't.
So let's move now to the present day. You're here living at Gabriel Court.
Yes.
How long have you been living here?
10 years.
10 years. And what made you move to this development in particular? You could have moved to any development, but why did you choose?
Because I didn't mind where I came virtually, and Sarah had found this, and it was new.
Yeah.
Nobody lived here before. I was happy, as I say, with my views. I can see the golf course. I was happy with the views. And the only thing I said to her when I rang the next day, I said, well, if you can reserve that one, I'll come. But I have one criteria, Sarah. I'm getting rid of all the furniture. I'm not bringing anything. And she said, do what you like, which is... I did bring. The bookcase came, that came. That came, the little table came because it has history. Everything else was new, everywhere.
Yeah.
I didn't bring it because it wouldn't have fitted in.
How do you find this type of community living? Because this is an independent living development, so you've obviously got independence.
I wouldn't have come if it didn't say independent on the thing. It is not. It is less independent now because it's made by the people here. You can go anywhere. You could go to a 5-star hotel to live, but it would be the people that you were with that make it. And a lot of the new people like community living. I go to things, yes, but I don't sit downstairs for hours chatting.
Yeah.
I don't. It's not that I'm antisocial. I'd rather read my book.
Yeah, that's just personal preference.
It is. It's personal preference.
But there's always that opportunity for some social interaction, which is really nice.
Exactly. There's the Christmas lunch and things like that, and that's what I want. But I'm not. I can't bear the thought of being dependent on anyone.
Yeah. So really, this kind of community living is perfect for you.
Suits me.
Perfect. Yeah.
And so. Yeah, I'm at home here now.
Yeah.
And as I'm ageing, heaven forbid I should say that, I can manage. I bath myself. I've not every day. I used to have a bath every morning when I got up, but no, I'm afraid it's only about 3 times a week now. But my whole wish in life is that I stay as independent as I am till my dying day.
Yeah. So I'm going to end the episode the way that I end every episode.
Yes.
And I'll ask you, Jo, what one piece of advice would you give to the younger generations?
Make the most of any opportunity, but don't envy the person next to you. And don't try to compete. Don't try to compete with the success of other people.
Well, that is your lot for the first episode of my second series. I would like to thank you, Joe, for joining me today and sharing your incredible life experiences with us. Make sure you join me next week with my guest Brenda, who will be here sharing her life stories through the decades. And of course, don't forget to share the podcast on Spotify or YouTube, and turn on the notifications to never miss an episode. Apart from that, I'll see you next week.